medically understood.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and you're listening to the Reasoning Aloud YouTube channel and podcast. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Sam Hoadley-Brill, a PhD candidate in philosophy at City University of New York. And we are talking about critical race theory. Now, if you listened to the last episode where I talked to Dr. Roderick Graham, we also discussed this same subject. We talked about it in very broad strokes. We talked about the issues involved in sociology and knowledge gathering and how the public interfaces with those ideas of dealing with power structures and other systemic issues, and how it can be hard for the average person to sort of interface with those academic ideas at a very broad level. And I think that was a very good episode that laid a lot of the groundwork for understanding the conversation that Sam and I have. It's not essential, but if you want to go back and give that a listen before this one, it would probably do you a bit of good. Sam and I spend a lot of time talking about the specifics of critical race theory. We talk about the critical legal theory that it kind of grew out of, and then we talk a lot about the individual elements of this very broad school of scholarship. And we spend a good amount of time unbraiding the criticisms that have been made against it by people who have decided to turn this into America's most recent moral panic. We talk about racial essentialism, the idea of living in a colorblind society, standpoint versus deference epistemology. We talk about corporate diversity trainings and how those grew out of critical race theory, or more accurately, diversity trainers aped a lot of the language of critical race theory and have used it for their own ends, arguably to very bad purposes. So we really get into the thick of it, and we talk about it in a way that I hope is accessible to the average person. I myself did not have a huge depth of knowledge on this subject going into this conversation. What I knew about critical race theory before sitting down to this conversation was gathered by reading an article by one Bradley Mason. It was called What is Critical Theory? An Introduction to the Movement and Its Ideas, and reading Sam's Conceptual Disinformation Substack, where he goes through and point by point debunks a lot of the anti-CRT talking points. I then went back and tried to read some of the primary literature that both of those gentlemen cited, Derek Bell, Delgado, Crenshaw. I've made it through some of them, but I'm not a legal scholar, and it's difficult stuff to understand, and Sam and I talk about that, and how at times the difficulty of the subject material gives grifters and people who would cynically position themselves as oppositionists to this theory in order to sell themselves and a moral panic to you. They can exploit that difficulty in the scholarship. So we talk all about that. And my hope is that if you are unfamiliar with critical race theory, if all that you've heard or know about it comes from watching your conservative friends being outraged about it because Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham told them that they need to be, or you yourself are one of those people, that you will come away with this with, if not your mind changed, then at a minimum, a better understanding of what it is that you're being, not to be punny, but critical of. And I think that that's important. So I want to thank Sam for having this conversation with me, and we will get right to it as soon as I do the obligatory plug of my second channel. If you don't want to watch this whole thing in one go, you can go down to the bottom of my YouTube page and click on RA Clips. It's my second channel, and this whole conversation is broken up into smaller videos and talking points, so you can listen to it a la carte. I also have a Twitch channel at Reasoning Aloud, where I play Stardew Valley. So if you want to chill and unwind, you can find me there. Special thank you to my patrons, whose names should appear on the screen now. It is my hope that with this episode, you will start getting the audio of these clips before I actually release them. So as soon as I process the audio, I will be uploading that. Now, this episode in particular, I think the audio and video may come out concurrently. I want to get this out there as quickly as I can because the discourse on critical race theory is moving so quickly. And I want to give people something that they can refer back to and have meaningful counter arguments to what they're hearing. But going forward, as soon as I get the audio done, I will release that for that episode, and then the videos will come out, part of my normal release cycle. When I get enough patrons that I can afford a Vimeo. When I get enough patrons that I can afford a Vimeo subscription, I will start releasing the video early as well for my patrons. So if you want to see that happen, go to patreon.com/reasoningaloud, give me $1 a month, and eventually we'll get there. And without further delay, I give you Sam Hoadley-Brill. Sam Hoadley-Brill, thank you so much for joining us. I've been trying to get a hold of you for a minute now, and I'm so glad you could join us. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Before we get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be in the situation where you're having these types of conversations, and just how you're in this whole discourse clusterfuck that we find ourselves in.
Uh, yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. My journey into this discourse, shall we say, has uh, I mean, in some ways, it goes back a long ways. I've been seriously interested in racial issues. I want to say since about my senior year of high school. Um, got really into it. Got really into these issues in a serious way when Kendrick Lamar's album "To Pimp a Butterfly" came out, and I was just like, he was like my favorite artist, and Good Kid, Mad City had prompted me to like, you know, I was moved by it, the storytelling and the sorts of issues that plagued a lot of Black Americans living in impoverished communities, ghettos, and then To Pimp a Butterfly struck me as like basically like a thesis statement on being like life as like a Black man in America. And then in college, I took a few classes that touched on racial issues, specifically a freshman seminar called "What White People Need to Know," and that was with a history professor who was also white, but whose life's work is on ethnic and racial issues and the history surrounding that. And he became sort of like a mentor to me. But I majored in philosophy, and the philosophy department at UC Santa Barbara, where I was at, didn't have anyone working on any racial issues. Philosophy is a very white discipline. Uh, Probably, I think, the whitest in all of the humanities. The humanities and social sciences are generally more racially and ethnically diverse than, say, like the hard sciences and like math. But philosophy is one that has stayed very white. Because if you look at uh, your average syllabus for a philosophy class, it's going to be mostly old dead white dudes that you're reading.
Yeah.
Then through my graduate program, where I just finished my second year, one of the few and one of the pioneers of bringing in black the black radical tradition into philosophy, and not just relegated to like political science and sociology and history classes, has been my professor Charles Mills. And so he's focused a lot on bringing in questions of racial justice to questions of political philosophy, because one of philosophy's central issues it's supposed to take up are questions of justice. And one of the most significant and widespread and pervasive and influential forms of injustice in the past 500 years in modern history that has been very central is racial injustice. So that got me interested in
Right.
that's how I sort of got into like racial issues and to be studying things where I would be reading critical race theorists. But in terms of getting interested in just sort of like the culture wars generally, that came sort of by accident. I had a friend who was reviewing cynical theories by James
Okay.
Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, Oliver Traldi. He was in the process of reviewing it, and then I found a copy online, torrented it, um, and was able to do a review myself. And basically, like, I was sort of somewhat sympathetic to the general approach that these people were coming at it, like, this anti-woke approach where they're saying, look, there's this sort of excess in the scholarship, these fields that they called grievance studies, where they said, a lot of this stuff is really just sort of jargon, mindless political nonsense, not very rigorous. And I I had seen some scholarship that I thought would fall into that sort of categorization. But then when I read cynical theories, I was reading stuff that I had read for a class uh, on decolonial feminism, and some of the content from that class was the sort of thing that I took issue with. But the way that they were portraying it in the book was completely misrepresenting the actual arguments of the scholars, and I was like, well, you can criticize these people, but some of the stuff that they're saying just completely made up. And so that got me into that sort of thing. I wrote a critical book review, and then both of those authors blocked me. And then I got into the the Chris Rufo critical race theory stuff because he started to go after it very aggressively, and it was quite clear that he and James Lindsay were working together on this, and that his knowledge of critical race theory, his knowledge of critical race theory, basically came exclusively from James Lindsay's nonsense propaganda. And so that's how I got into the propaganda side of the debate. Yeah.
Cool, cool. Yeah, and I think if you examine the work of these people, it becomes apparent very quickly that they they are working an angle, right? They're not taking this, like you said, there are plenty of valid criticisms to some of this scholarship, and I hope we actually get to some of that, because it can be done in good faith and in a way that
Absolutely.
is productive. That is not what these people are doing. And to that end, what I thought we'd do is, and you know far more about this subject than I do, so I think I'm going to put you in a leadership position here to get us through, and I'm going to serve as the man on the street just asking questions. I have a brief familiarity or a very shallow familiarity with this work. But I know enough that we should probably start with critical theory, the legal theory,
Sure.
and just sort of ground everything in the understanding of what that is, and then move into talking about critical race theory that arose out of it, and then probably spend some time talking about the people who are working their own angle from the liberal identity politics, grievance, diversity committee angle, and how, in many ways, what's happening is a response to that from just a completely an orthogonal direction. Does that sound like a good way to structure things?
Yeah. Sounds great.
Okay, so critical theory. What is that? In you've got 5 seconds.
So critical theory, uh, you mentioned specifically like critical legal studies.
Yeah.
The okay. So
So that would be like Bell and Delgado, if I'm not mistaken, right?
so those scholars, I guess you could say, were came out of critical legal studies and then pioneered critical race theory as a
Okay.
response to what they perceived as the shortcomings of critical legal studies. So
Okay.
critical theory itself is the name that was is a name of like, a sort of school of thought that is associated with the Frankfurt School intellectuals from Germany who um, fled Germany during Hitler, right? They fled Nazi Germany, came to the United States, and worked on a number of issues. They were Marxist intellectuals who were sort of like disappointed with, uh, or who had come to see Marx's historical materialism, his historical theory, as flawed in many ways because, you know, in response, they had just seen that, in fact, rather than the proletariat rising up and overthrowing the bourgeoisie who were oppressing them, that the proletariat would sort of go to war uh, and take up their national identity over their shared political or I guess labor identity. So the question was, okay, well, how does this happen? They're inspired by the work of uh, Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács, and these people started to recognize, or basically thought that Marx didn't take sufficient account of culture and the influence that that would have on uh, on the
I
workers.
think that's just a thing worth emphasizing is that a lot of these people, though they might call themselves Marxists, were actually quite critical of Marx
Oh
in a
yeah,
number of
oh
ways.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and
So in the sense that like I would call myself somewhat of a Kantian when it comes to moral theory, but I
mhm,
still think that there are plenty of things that Kant got wrong. Um, and so the, people are quick to latch on to the Marxist identity label because, especially in the
mhm,
United States with the history of the Cold War and everything, become such a boogeyman. So conservatives know that they can invoke that to sort of get, this hyper reactionary response from a lot of people. Marx can't have that. Marx is evil, right? So then
right.
critical theory, these Frankfurt School philosophers started to focus on, uh, basically, they wanted to apply Marx's methodology of criticizing basically everything, right? Marx had this idea
Mhm,
of relentless criticism of basically all existing social conditions, and people make that sound to be super pessimistic. But if you think about it, that's basically just like the scientific method, but applied to social conditions rather than the natural phenomena. You relentlessly criticize things, and you see, uh, does this theory work? Does that theory work? And how do we sort of develop a better and better
yeah,
account of social phenomena? So, and when it comes to
right.
legal scholarship, the critical legal studies people sort of applied a Marxian lens to the law to show how, you know, very neutral looking on the surface law could still serve to perpetuate uh, and in fact engender class oppression and class subordination. So, for instance, you know, the law that says it's illegal to ask for money on the street, that doesn't specify whether it's illegal for the working class, the poor, or the rich. But of course, only the poor, right, are going to ever be in a position where they need
Mhm,
to ask for money on the street. So it's framed in a way such
right,
that it's neutral. It applies to everyone, but really, in practice, it only applies to a select few, the people who are poor. So
right.
that's a way in which classism can be embedded in the law without actually picking out, the workers. Uh, And so critical race theory basically grew out of that in the sense that they saw this as an important development in terms of seeing the ways in which facially neutral, liberal, colorblind, and class blind, you might say, legal institutions and policies can still serve to create and then perpetuate injustices on a social level. But
But
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
so just so to clarify, the project of critical theory, um, it's from what I've been able to tell and from what you've described, seems to be at its core an idea of criticizing the assumptions of the system within which you live. So we all
Yes,
come to the
that's
table
a
with a
great
certain
yes,
level of when I walk out the door tomorrow morning, I am making certain assumptions about the social, legal, and government and economic system that I live
exactly.
in order to continue my day. And what the critical theorists are trying to say is you should actually interrogate those systems and figure out if they're actually working in the interest of one group over another, and you shouldn't just
Exactly.
accept them as neutral. Would that be fair?
Excellent analysis. And so
Thank you.
that comes from the the Marx himself's idea, which, it's interesting that this is attributed to Marx, but really you find this in Plato's Republic. The character
Mhm.
Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic says, when so in the first book of Plato's Republic, they're asking, what is justice, right? And so Socrates talks to this guy Cephalus, and then he talks to Polemarchus, and they're trying to figure out what justice is. And then Thrasymachus comes in, and he says, "Oh, you guys are talking all this nonsense about justice, and you know, you want to know the truth. This is what justice is. Justice is just the interest of the stronger." Socrates is like, "Huh? Say some more, Thrasymachus. What do you mean?" And Thrasymachus is like, "Well, look, in every polity, what happens is there are some people in power. Those people, right? In a democracy, the demos is in power. In a tyranny, you have the tyrant in power. In a aristocracy, the aristocrats are in power. And in every case, those people in power implement the kinds of laws that benefit them. In an aristocracy, you have aristocratic laws. Democracy, democratic laws. And this constitutes a conception of justice. So you have this variety based on what kind of state you're in, but you have this underlying unity in every political institution. The What is conceived of as justice is just that which benefits those who are in power,
Yeah.
because
And
they set it up
Plato,
to benefit
yeah,
them.
and
And so
Plato
that's
spent a not insignificant amount of his career trying to rebut that, or to
right.
poke holes in that.
And that's
Uh,
no, that's sort of the project of the Republic, is
yeah,
to debunk that whole thing that Thrasymachus sets up. Yeah.
yeah.
But you see the same sort of thing in Marx. Marx, the quote, I believe, in every epoch, the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class. And so the ideas of the ruling ideas about morality, ruling ideas about the economy, ruling ideas about marriage, ruling ideas about uh, what sorts of professions are noble or ignoble. All these
The
things,
the ruling
basically
ideas about who should
ideology.
oppose the ruling party.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that is where, these critical theorists, as you said, right? They want to expose the sorts of things that we're taking for granted that we're not seeing because of the fact that they're just assumed as normal under whatever sort of paradigm you've been inculcated in, so that you treat what is actually a social condition or social uh, construct or creation as natural. We naturalize the social.
They want you paying attention to the ground you're walking on,
Exactly.
effectively. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that is the environment, the academic milieu out of which critical race theory evolved. Uh,
Exactly.
and I'm gonna let you run with that.
Yeah. So basically, like the critical legal studies, as I said, it's very focused on class and how class oppression can be engendered in the law, and we might not see it because on the surface it's all facially neutral, and that there
Mhm.
are certain legal institutions set up that benefit, the property holding elite at the expense of the have-nots. Right? They benefit the haves at the expense of the have-nots. And I mean, when you focus on capitalism in particular, a lot of people forget that some of the things we take for granted today uh, had to be fought for very hard by workers in the United States. I mean, the fact that child labor is now illegal, it was not always that way, and a lot of children had to die gruesome, horrific deaths in factories for there to become enough political pressure to the point where that had to actually get outlawed. So there's a lot of things that we take for granted that way. And critical race theory says critical legal studies is on the right track, but it is ignoring the the large extent to which race and racism can be embedded in the law rather than just sort of class subordination. So they wanted to introduce uh, a theory that showed exactly how, especially in the post-civil rights era,
Mhm.
after African Americans and other racial minorities had on paper achieved racial equality, right? You have these landmark civil rights legislation that promise to bring us to a state of racial equality, but a few years after, and even in Martin Luther King's last years before he was assassinated, I mean, he was arguing the exact same thing that then Derek Bell basically built his career off of, which is that, look, these things are important steps forward, but they're nowhere near sufficient to address the horrific history that African Americans have been subjected to. 250 years of slavery, 100
Right.
years of continued second class citizenship, Jim Crow, lynchings, you know, segregation, right?
Yeah.
The impoverished school system, all these things, you can't just pass some laws and then say, all right, like now you're equal, because they need, African Americans need redress for that, for all these wrongs and for all the wealth that they've been deprived of that they actually created. Post Jim Crow, now all the laws are colorblind and facially neutral, right? We have this, and liberalism is, legal liberalism in the sense that they talk about it, is the idea that we're now just going to have slow and steady progress, and eventually African Americans will reach, you know, uh, a state of equality, and however long it takes. We should just be colorblind. We shouldn't focus on race anymore. Like, let's sort of just get over it. And critical race theorists would say, no, that's not going to work. That's not going to
Right.
work, because we have to address the wrongs. We need reparations and programs to fix this so that we can actually get on an equal footing.
Right. And I think one of the more insidious aspects of the counter narrative to critical race theory, really, the pushback against it, is that if you don't accept the conclusions of critical race theory, which is that enacting colorblind legislation did not fix everything, that you have to account for historical injustices, you have to account for historical inequalities in wealth, and that's just a segment of our population was not allowed to participate economically or politically in any meaningful way for a very long period of time. And if you don't accept that that's going to have ramifications, then you are left with only really one logical conclusion to explain present inequality, and that is a deficiency on the part of the people who are unequal. So
Right.
it really is a prescription for arriving at very racist ideas, even if
Yeah.
that is not what is being actively advocated for by the people who are pushing that counter narrative.
Right. And because the kind of biological racism that was more popular in, say, the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, is sort of largely taboo and frowned upon. What you end up having nowadays is a sort of cultural racism, which says that, the problem is not the racist history and the legacy of the segregation and racial discrimination and prevention of accumulation of wealth in black communities. No, the problem is that since the passage of the civil rights movement, there's sort of just been this pathological black culture in the inner cities that has led them to glorify crime, and you get takes about the pernicious influence of hip hop music and all these sorts of things that lead people to think that black Americans, while they're not inherently biologically inferior, they will say that they're culturally inferior. And then the question is, okay, well, even if you think that they're culturally inferior, what material conditions led to the creation of this culture that you find so pathological? And it seems clear to me that anyone who is going to be intellectually honest about that is going to have to account for the racist history that led into such a culture that they claim to be inferior. Which, I mean, I think that whole notion bogus, anyways. But even if you want to try to steel man their
Right.
position, you might say, then still the question is, okay, well, where does this culture come from?
Right. And I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about how culture develops, but fundamentally, there's going to be two major uh, explanations for it. Either it is uh, a product of the conditions in which you live, or it is a product of your genes, right? It's
Right.
nature and nurture at some level. And I think that at some level, that's what's being insinuated. You can't make a racially essentialist argument anymore. If you're someone who is racist, you have to kick the can down the road a little bit and let the person that you're talking to make that argument in their own head, because there's no other way to explain that. It's one or the other at bottom, right? If you think about it for longer than 5 seconds. So it's putting the work into the head of the listener, or more likely, and in many cases, allowing them not to think too hard about it.
Mm.
Which racial essentialism is that is a charge that's made against critical race
Oh,
theory,
yeah.
oddly enough. So I thought maybe we could spend some time unbraiding that particular little nugget of
Yeah,
of
that's a good idea. So, essentialism in philosophy, the idea of an essence in philosophy, you can trace back to at least Aristotle, and the idea of an essential property being basically, so say you have a kind of thing, uh,
Mhm.
human, right? So if there is an essential human nature, then what it means, what that means is that there is some property such that if a human were to lack that property, they would cease to be human. They wouldn't even be human, right? So it's a sort of
Mhm.
property without which one would not be the kind of thing one is, right? So
Right.
yeah, so if there's some human nature, then I must have that property, otherwise I can't be a human being. So then if we apply that to race, the idea is that, okay, racial essentialism is the thesis that races exist, right? And that they're on some level can be distinguished from one another in neat enough ways to be able to uh, distinguish between them. And each race, for each race, there is some either property or set of properties that each member of that race has, in virtue of which the member counts as a member of that race. So whether
Right.
it's for the most part, it's going to be like a genetic idea that people have certain genetic sequence or biological traits, phenotypical traits, maybe that uh, they have these, and in virtue of having them, they count as a member of that race, or their ancestors come from this demographic, or I mean, geographic location, therefore they count it, something like that, right? Now, I think that can't be this can't be vindicated at all because of the fact of like mixed race.
Mhm.
Clearly, like, I mean, how are you going to distinguish uh, the races, and especially over the past, you know, couple hundred years, especially since the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism and imperialism and the massive amounts of like rape and pillaging and sort of like fusion of cultures and different genetic populations and all that sort of thing. So like basically, it fundamentally to me can't get off the ground. But you could have another kind of racial essentialism, and it could be a sort of cultural racial essentialism, or it could be a
Mm.
political, depending on what kind of theory of race like what kind of metaphysics of race you want to have. So some people want to have a political metaphysics of race, according to which, say, to be a member of the black race uh, fundamentally involves being subordinated along some lines in society. So that would be a kind of political conception of race, which then,
Mm.
has this sort of strange consequence that if there is a society in which, you know, a black person is, say, the king or queen of that society, then they probably wouldn't count as black. So I think that kind of theory is strange to me. Um, and and it would also have the thesis that in which that there could be we couldn't even conceive of a black person. We basically couldn't even conceive of racial equality. Racial equality would then be a kind of contradiction in terms. So I think that conception of race is kind of strange. Other people want to have a cultural
Hmm.
conception of race, according to which to be a member of race fundamentally involves some sort of shared history and certain sort of shared cultural norms with the other members of that race. And so you could try to come up with a cluster of concepts that would be essential to that race. Some people want to have that. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois has something like that kind of theory of races at some point during his life. He was a huge pioneering uh, black scholar and one of the most crucial members or most crucial contributors to the black radical tradition. And
Hmm.
the philosopher Chike Jeffers has sort of taken up his kind of cultural theory of race, and I think it has interesting things to say. Ultimately, I still don't think that can work. But when it comes to critical race theory, there isn't really a clear metaphysics of race operating. Like they don't really exactly spell it
Right.
out. What they do focus on, especially because they're doing legal scholarship, is the ways in which law delineates racial categories, the ways in which law can prescribe who counts as a member of, say, the white race or the black race. And you can go and look. There's a really good book by the law professor at UC Berkeley, Ian Haney Lopez, which uh, I believe it's called the. Actually, I'm not. I can't remember what the title is. The Creation of Whiteness or something like that. Where uh, where
Oh,
he
you're
yeah.
talking about the how the no, I'm thinking of a different book called How the Irish Became White. But
Right.
uh,
Very similar. But Ian Haney Lopez has a book, his first book, and it was very, lauded and celebrated. And towards the end of the book, he has this list of like all these various court rulings of
mhm,
people of certain ethnicities, right? Say you're half Chinese and half white. Are you white? Say you're an eighth Chinese, an eighth Korean, and a fourth Japanese, and half white. Are you white? Right? And there's like hardly any consistency. It's not like there's some predictable pattern, but you can see uh, how deeply intertwined in American history race and the law are in terms of the the litigation of racial categories. So that I mean it's clearly anti-essentialist there.
right. And it's so excuse me. So we would say that critical race theory is at its core anti-racial essentialism, right? In fact,
I would,
critical race
yeah.
theory, as far as I can tell, to the limited extent that I've been able to understand this literature, uh, is is actually at some level critical of the idea of. I mean, it disregards race in any meaningful category other than as one which is socially constructed to serve the interests of a particular dominant party, in this case, white people. Um, so, how did we get to the point where critics of critical race theory are saying that CRT essentializes black and white people along certain lines, with black people being inferior and whites being inherently superior? Why is critical race theory effectively just a justification for Nazi Germany? Please explain.
Well, so there's a complication. Uh, so you said that, you know, the only the only significance that critical race theorists gave to racial categories at all was as social constructs that were used, for the purposes of enriching the dominant race, right, whites, and so that they could sort of exploit the subordinated races. That's true to an extent, but there are critical race theorists. So another tenet very common in critical race theory that you'll see is um, insistence on the the value of claiming one's racial identity as a subordinated, say, as a subordinated racial minority. So black people coming together and affirming their blackness, and sort of like
Hmm.
reclaiming this oppressed identity as a form of, right, identity politics, right, and so that they can develop a kind of racial consciousness that uh, is sometimes useful in order to achieve certain civil rights gains, right? And and you see that in the civil rights movement, right? The idea of Black Power. You see that in the fight
Hmm.
for LGBTQ rights, right? The ability to get gay marriage legalized. We there had to be a kind of sense in which gay people identified strongly as gay people, so that they made this identity, an important part of who they were. And that
Right.
can sometimes,
When you find yourself at the losing end of a power differential, it is often very useful to have that as a rallying point for
right.
your people to get around to address that power differential itself. So you have black nationalism and gay
hmm
pride and things like that. Is that
Yeah, exactly. So, and people often claim that, like, this is counterproductive. This goes against, like, um, the vision of Martin Luther King Jr. These sorts of things. I think it'll be useful to just include a couple of quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. on this point to just bust some myths. So
sure, absolutely.
these all come from his last book, written and published before he died. Where do we go from here? And these are on pages 130 to 133 in the most recent version. So uh, a few quotes. So Martin Luther King Jr. writes, "To overcome this terrible feeling of being less than human, the Negro must assert for all to hear and see a majestic sense of his worth. There is such a thing as a desegregated mind. We must no longer allow the outer chains of an oppressive society to shackle our minds. With courage and fearlessness, we must set out daringly to stabilize our egos. This alone will give us a confirmation of our roots and a validation of our worth. This sense of somebodyness means the refusal to be ashamed of being black. A second important step that the Negro must take is to work passionately for group identity. This does not mean group isolation or group exclusivity. It means the kind of group consciousness that Negroes need in order to participate more meaningfully at all levels of the life of our nation. This form of group unity can do infinitely more to liberate the Negro than any action of individuals. We have been oppressed as a group, and we must overcome that oppression as a group." Gives you
Yeah,
basic sort of justification as to why that might be important. And that kind of thing,
yeah.
that affirmation, to say, I am a black man, not just a man who happens to be black, for instance, as Kimberly Crenshaw puts it in one of her papers, I think, Mapping the Margin. Um, so, I am a black person, not just a person who happens to be black. That sort of thing is often invoked by critics like James Lindsay as evidence of a kind of racial essentialism.
Right. And I think that also offers itself as a strong critique uh, a a colorblind society existing at all presently, or
Presently, right?
that that is a that implementing the activities which would take place in such an idealized society is somehow a useful path to arriving at it. Um,
Exactly.
um, and I do want to talk about the tension that exists between like color blindness and this subject, but maybe we could spend a little more time on how we got to the point where James Lindsay can say, even if he's stretching the words 100 times past their tensile strength, that there is something embedded within critical race theory that says all white people are inherently evil and racist, because that is a claim that gets levied quite a bit.
Oh yeah. Um, so here we get into more of the rhetorical strategies associated with the kinds of CRT critics and propagandists today, because I really have seen nothing in the actual in this stuff right here, this critical race theory, the big actual volumes of legal scholarship that you know could not possibly be taught in K through 12 schools, and that is like the sort of thing you would read in an elective course in law school if you go to law
Mhm.
school, uh, maybe in an undergraduate class somewhere. But nowadays, critical race theory is being deliberately expanded and inflated to encompass a whole host of basically progressive attempts at anti-racist intellectual pursuits, or uh oftentimes even not even intellectual pursuits, sort of like this, like diversity trainings and other kinds of activism. So people will conflate Black Lives Matter with critical race theory,
Mhm.
uh and they've sort of deliberate, I mean, right, and that famous series of tweets from Chris Rufo that everyone's seen a million times, where he explicitly says that his goal is to uh, distort the meaning of critical race theory to get people to associate it with whatever sort of race talk they don't like, that race talk that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so this has been very successful.
Right. It's
But
it's
the
specifically being used as a vector of attack to make conservative white people feel uncomfortable with absolute cynicism,
and even
right? Like,
liberal white people, yeah,
yeah.
you know,
And I
yeah,
think that's something that we kind of need to own. Like, we need to be very honest about here is sometimes there are very few conversations I think that are had publicly where you can confidently assert bad faith on your opponent, where you can confidently say that the people you're talking to and about are acting cynically. This is one of those
right,
occasions.
yeah,
I have not encountered anyone who is publicly marketing themselves as an anti-CRT public intellectual who is not operating at an over 9,000 power level of just absolute cynicism and griftery. It's like these are not people who are actually interested in having a real conversation. You know far more about that than I have because you've endured many of those conversations.
and I think unfortunately there's a sense in which there actually are people who take themselves to be operating in good faith, uh, anti-CRT people who you could call anti-CRT propagandists or public intellectuals, and they are not consciously
Hmm.
operating on the level of the Rufo or the Lindsay in
Can
bad
can
faith.
you give an example of somebody who
Sure.
might be doing
For
that?
instance, I think largely John McWhorter. Actually, it
Mm,
depends on the topic, but um, that I think that basically a lot of people have just been so thoroughly exposed to the propaganda campaign pioneered by Rufo and Lindsay
mhm.
that they've just sort of internalized that critical race theory in fact is and properly refers to all of the things that they see it referred to as on Fox News and such, so that they 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 actually end up in the kind of situation that critical theorists want to criticize, right? Where they
Right.
can't see the ground that they're walking on, or the water that they're swimming in. Um, and thus, in those cases, I think it's unfortunate, and it's not that they're not responsible for
Yeah.
um, actually coming to see the deceit that they've been subject to, but that I don't feel comfortable, putting the same kind of bad faith label on them as I do on a Rufo or a Lynn.
So I think that's fair. That's fair. They so there's at the top though there is this layer of like just deep cynicism, and then
Yeah.
underneath it are a group of people who have not engaged meaningfully with the scholarship, and for good reason. It is very dry and boring. I have not enjoyed reading any of this. I'm very
Yeah.
mad at Chris Rufo for making me have to read this shit. I'm not a lawyer. I don't
Yeah.
like. I've ran out of Adderall. Like there's just it's so I will never forgive him for making me have to read all this stuff. But there is this group of people, and I had this came up in my conversation with Roderick Graham as well, where the way that scholarship is communicated to people, it's just not done well, right? There are these obscure, arcane
Mhm, mhm.
things that happen in the halls of Harvard Law School that are absolutely opaque to the average citizen, and all it takes is one person to come along and cherry pick 5 or 6 lines from a dissertation 20 years ago and
Mhm.
turn it into the next moral panic,
Right.
and then you have a sea of people who can't see the forest for the trees or who mistake the map for the territory, a lot of whom
Yeah.
would probably be insulted by the fact that I would recommend that they probably should read Baudrillard to get over that. But but we'll save that for another day. But it's just it there's so before we get into just going ham on Rufo and his people, I do want to touch on the go back to the colorblind thing,
Yeah.
because that is an important thing to talk about, because the way that it's misrepresented by Rufo and Lindsay and Pluckers and all these other people is that critical race scholars want to live in a racially essentialized world where all we think and talk about is our
Mm,
race and our color.
correct.
That is not true.
Right.
What they largely want is to live in a world where being colorblind is a natural occurrence because the material and social and economic conditions in which you live predispose you to not caring about your race. But we presently live in a world where that is not a productive path for survival if you have any interest in being aware of your situation in relationship to your fellow citizens, particularly if you are Black or a person of color. You cannot afford to be colorblind. And acting as though we are, particularly from a standpoint of a position of power in the law, is not a recipe for getting us to the end goal. Just I think that's something worth really talking about, because I think that's a place where a magic trick gets pulled. There's some misdirection and it really sends people in the wrong direction.
Yeah. I totally agree, and um, it's really unfortunate the reason behind all this. Why is it that people get this idea that color blindness uh, is sort of the way forward? Like, where does that come from? And the only answer I really seem to be able to get, and this is something I've been exploring because it's sort of a realization, kind of epiphany that I had um, recently, is the only thing that really anybody seems to be able to appeal to is one line in a Martin Luther King Jr. speech that doesn't even support the claim that they're making. So what Martin Luther
Hmm.
King Jr. says is, I have a dream that one day my 4 children will live in a world where they are judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Okay,
Hmm.
what can we take from that? Martin Luther King Jr. has as an end goal a society in which race does not determine your outcomes, and in which people do not judge others on the basis of their skin color, but on the basis of their character, on their personality, their actions, their intentions, right, their goodwill, this sort of thing. And to me, the way I like to think about it is, okay, now what what in that implies that the way to achieve that society is to just stop seeing color and stop treating race as socially significant, and basically, I guess, pretend that the history of racial injustice and discrimination and exploitation on the basis of race has not structured the present in which we now live. I mean, it like if you go look for any justification of this idea of colorblindness, and I don't want to straw man colorblindness. When people say colorblindness, they don't mean actually like not seeing people's race. Okay, I think most serious thinkers will
Right.
acknowledge that that's not sort of cognitively possible given the socialization we have into seeing race. Right? It's not like I'll see
Right.
you and be like, well, are you white? Is he
Right.
black? No, I don't know.
For instance, we don't make categorical assumptions about people with uh, a small amount of melanin in their hair, but blonde jokes are still a thing, right? Like we see the
Right.
thing, but we're
Like
not
hair
going to
color,
act.
yeah. Hair
Yeah.
color is a good analogy, right? Like, with the, the somewhat exception of, red-haired people who are the brunt of some, South Park and otherwise jokes, right? Your hair color does not influence to a significant degree your hair color itself, right? Sometimes,
Mhm.
it could, and, especially given other racial biases like,
Right.
preference for like Aryans, right? But your hair color alone does not predict what kind of life chances you're going to have in the way that like your race, to a much larger extent. Obviously, it's not completely determinative, but your people have different on average outcomes in American society given if you only have the information of their race, you can predict, you know, uh, things about them the way you can't with hair color. And so colorblind is not the idea that we stop seeing race. Right. It's the idea that in our moral and political policies and judgments and uh, and programs, we do not allow race to play any kind of role. We don't take race into consideration in determining who is to be given or in terms of how we allocate our resources, how we sort of distribute goods, how we determine merit for certain things or who's admitted to certain schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So that idea of colorblindness. Now, there are advocates for that idea of colorblindness. Chiefly today, you can find like Coleman Hughes is a
Mhm.
young, up and coming public intellectual who is I probably would say is not like probably wouldn't self describe as conservative, but has worked for conservative think tanks and has made conservative kinds of arguments. But uh, you know fundamentally, one of the things he pushes the most is this idea of colorblindness, which he claims to have derived from the work of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, there's just so many
Mhm.
passages in Martin Luther King Jr.'s work, like as I've said already, right? The one passage that everyone quotes doesn't even support colorblindness. It says, "Look, this is the end goal." It doesn't specify any means to getting to that end goal. And there are other places where Martin Luther King Jr. explicitly specifies racially conscious means as necessary to that end goal. So I have some more quotes I can briefly touch on there. I think are relevant. Um,
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
so here we have, let's see. Oop. Okay. Sorry. Here we go. Right here. So this is from the book, uh, Why We Can't Wait. This sort of thing is outlined briefly also in um, his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? But at the end, you'll see at the end of the passage where he discusses it, you'll see he has an end note that says, "For a more detailed analysis, see his I think it's 1964 book, uh, Why We Can't Wait." So he writes, among the many vital jobs to be done, the nation must not only radically readjust its attitude toward the Negro in the compelling present, but must incorporate in its planning some compensatory consideration for the handicaps he has inherited from the past. It is impossible to create a formula for the future which does not take into account that our society has been doing something special against the Negro for hundreds of years. How then can he be absorbed into the mainstream of American life if we do not do something special for him now in order to balance the equation and equip him to compete on a just and equal basis? Whenever this issue of compensatory or preferential treatment for the Negro is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask nothing more. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but is not realistic. For it is obvious that if a man is entered at the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. Then he goes on to describe how the Prime Minister of India was explaining how they were engaging in a sort of form of affirmative action for the population that they called the untouchables. And so he writes, the Indian government spends millions of rupees annually developing housing and job opportunities in villages heavily inhabited by untouchables. Moreover, the Prime Minister said, if two applicants compete for entrance into a college or university, one of the applicants being an untouchable and the other of high caste, the school is required to accept the untouchable. Professor Lawrence Reddick, who was with me during this interview, asked, but isn't that discrimination? Well, it may be, the Prime Minister answered, but this is our way of atoning for the centuries of injustices we have inflicted upon these people. Back to MLK. America must seek its own ways of atoning for the injustices she has inflicted upon her Negro citizens. I do not suggest atonement for atonement's sake, or because there is need for self-punishment. I suggest atonement as the moral and practical way to bring the Negro standards up to a realistic level. So, straightforward.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. The way that I have approached this, this sort of body of thought around color blindness, is it is a goal, right? That is the world we
Yeah.
want to live in. We want to live in a world where I would argue that the conceptions of race itself are done away with, where
Yeah.
we just no longer have these ideas of what it is to be white or black, that we're just human
Now,
beings right now.
some critical race theorists would contest that.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm aware. This is just where I'm coming
Yeah.
from
I
is
agree with you.
I think that is a beautiful long-term goal, and I think that that is something that we should pursue unless and when it comes into tension with redressing the material consequences of past oppression that puts a group of people who can thus by that past oppression be identified by one of those categories we seek to eliminate in a bad place. So we shoot for the one, and where we run into tension with the other, we always default to helping them in the present, because to ignore that, you will never reach your goal. That's kind of how I look at it. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive or incompatible ideas. I
Mm-hmm.
think you can do both. You just have to order them in a sort of hierarchy of needs. Like, well, we're always going to default to this one, and when we don't do that, we will pursue the other. That's
Yeah.
just sort of how I look at that.
I fully agree. And it's worth noting also that, MLK was very outspoken, especially in his latest years, about the need to, while addressing the racial wrongs and the racial injustice, to include in this campaign disadvantaged whites who were just simply economically oppressed or poor, or whose jobs had sort of they had been replaced by technology, or jobs been shipped overseas, or whatever it is. The fact being that there are a lot of economically disadvantaged, poor, and working class white people in the United States, and MLK wanted those people to be lifted out of poverty as well. It wasn't just a matter of helping out those who had suffered the specific racial wrongs of American history, but he wanted to benefit all oppressed people everywhere, in the United States, but also worldwide. And many people think so. Sometimes people will, once you get to this part of, the conversation, if you bring up the fact that MLK was actually against colorblindness, and people actually concede this, well, they'll come back and say, but look, MLK was also, had this universalist conception of also liberating oppressed white people. And so they'll use that as a kind of retort and say, well, critical race theory doesn't do that. They don't pay any attention to oppressed white people because they think all white people, just have this kind of privilege and therefore don't need any help whatsoever. And that's just wrong. I mean, that just shows that they haven't read the scholarship. There's plenty of work, starting with the founding father of critical race theory himself, Derek Bell, focusing on explanations of how a lot of oppressed white people have fallen victim to holding on to this myth of whiteness as a kind of a kind of blanket or a cover for which they can always have and that will always keep them in a sort of superior social role over oppressed black people, even if black people have more money than them, say, well, that at least they have their whiteness. And Derek Bell talks a lot about how that actually in fact has perpetuated not only white supremacy and delaying reparations and policies to uplift black Americans, but also has gone to the material disadvantage of white Americans themselves, and has prevented white Americans from actually, organizing and entering into solidarity with oppressed black Americans and advocating for a true kind of working class revolution or movement to actually uplift and advance the material conditions of all oppressed people. And Derek Bell, explicitly
Yeah.
says this. Also, Kimberly Crenshaw, with her notion of intersectionality, includes class. Maybe
Yeah.
it's fair to say that some, especially when you talk about like the diversity trainings nowadays, are going to ignore class. Well, because I wonder why those diversity trainers are in the elite, wealthy classes of their own, and they don't
We'll
want to
get to
focus
them.
on
We'll get to
class.
them.
But yeah,
Yeah, we're going to get to them. My understanding of what you just described came from reading Roll Jordan Roll by, what was his name? Uh, Roll Jordan Roll, Eugene Genovese, I think. Um, it's basically an analysis of the antebellum South from like a
hmm
Marxist perspective, and he goes into a lot of detail about how actually, in many ways, the like the non-slaveholding class of whites were very, very bad off, and they were sort of created this mythology of the instantiation of race as a concept to placate them so that they would have a
yeah,
reason not to, grab a pitchfork and move on the plantation to redress the economic problems that they were
right.
being faced with. So I think, yeah, that's a yeah. So Martin
More
Luther
more
King
on
makes a
this.
strong case for intersectionality.
Yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois as well, Black Reconstruction America, and notion of the wages of whiteness, which was then eventually taken up by David Roediger, um, who really built like a career on his exploration of uh, that whole kind of psychological phenomena. How exactly was it that white people accepted these, this kind of privilege of this mythological racial superiority as a kind of, I guess, compensation for the fact that they were still not being that their economic conditions were never advanced. And I mean, it's a good example of this kind of divide and conquer strategy where the ruling class
Mm.
pits these two working class populations against one another and then keeps them fighting with each other so that they don't come together and rise up.
Yeah, it would be to go back to the looking at the ground under your feet analogy. It would be we're both living on a shitty street with potholes, but I just happen to have like I got a set of Nikes, right? Like and you
Yeah,
don't. So
yeah.
I'm a little bit better off, and god
I
damn
got
it
an
if you come
HD.
for my fucking Nikes, like
Yeah,
I will yeah, we will not suffer the relinquishment of our Nikes. Never mind the fact that doing so might actually get us in a position where we could fix the fucking road.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so the other thing I wanted to talk about, because I think it leads very nicely into a discussion of the diversity training issue, is the difference between standpoint epistemology and deference epistemology.
Yes.
And I'm going to butcher this man's name. Um,
Olufemi Taiwo.
yes, thank you so much. So his essay, which I know you cited in your Substack, and I think that's how I came across it, being in the room privilege.
Yep.
Um, that is everything that we've talked about so far is going to be in the show notes. There's going to be links to it in the down there part. If I could recommend a single piece of writing for anybody who's listening to this to read, it would be this essay, because I think
Mhm.
it unbraids more than anything else the narrative that is being spun in a way that's very easy and accessible to understand. But let's start with what is standpoint epistemology, why it's important, and then we can talk about its problems and how I think those problems lead to this other set of problems that
Yeah.
so
So
I'm gonna let you
standpoint.
do that.
Yeah. No problem. Let's see if I can do this off top. So standpoint epistemology is inspired by Hegelian and Marxist notions of the sort of social situatedness of knowledge, and so social epistemology uh, builds on. So, I mean, it largely comes from feminist appropriations of Marx. So, feminist Marxism, and then largely just sort of feminist epistemology, and then eventually, like it branches into feminist, or this is I mean, I guess a subset of feminist epistemology in a sense, feminist philosophy of science, and the question being, okay, well, how does the whole advent of social epistemology came about as a sort of reaction to a sort of dominant, largely unquestioned uh, trend, or sort of just mainstream strand of epistemology and analytic philosophy, which treats the knower as a sort of just like isolated atomic individual, right? As a sort of, the kinds of paradigm cases of knowledge are that, that I know that there's a coffee cup on this table, right? So something very,
Mhm.
you know, something that a philosopher in his ivory tower uh, would come up with as an example while writing a paper, and not really thinking about the aspects of knowledge that are fundamentally social in nature. Now, they sort of seize upon this notion of class consciousness, uh, which is mentioned in Marx and Engels' work, but not theorized at length, and really comes about through the work of um, Georg Lukács, a Hungarian Marxist who was sort of a contemporary of the Frankfurt School thinkers. And this notion basically comes to say that the proletariat are in a sort of privileged epistemic position when it comes to knowledge of the system. This also actually is inspired deeply by W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness. And
Mm.
for
Okay.
Du Bois, the the so African Americans are in a special situation epistemically compared to white Americans, where white Americans see, the system as it is. They sort of take it, given that they're sort of like dominant status over African Americans in society. They don't have, a very rich understanding of the sort of system of oppression, of racial oppression that is at play in this society. African Americans, they know the white sort of imagination, the white conception of how society runs, the official story that people tell, but they also know the the oppressive realities, and the ways in which that story is fundamentally flawed and is crucially incomplete, and is a gross misrepresentation of the way that things actually work. It's not actually the case that every that we have liberty and justice for all, say, and or that everyone is treated equally in society. And so then basically the idea of African Americans having this kind of privileged epistemic position, being the subordinated, being the ones who actually experience this racial oppression, they know not only the sort of uh, official story as it's told by white Americans, but also the hidden aspects of the way society functions and oppression. So I mean, so that's the Du Bois version, and then largely the feminist version is basically the same sort of thing, but we're talking about patriarchy rather than white supremacy. So
Right. At each point, it's and just I don't think that we did this, but let's just a definition of epistemology
oh yeah,
is just the study and the way we come to understand knowledge. Is that a
right.
fair working
This
definition? Yeah.
the study of knowledge, how we come to knowledge, and then also not only knowledge but sort of justification of beliefs and sort of uh, the standards of knowledge, right? So, like, what
Okay.
constitutes knowledge? And because usually justification is built into the definition of what knowledge is, you have so also you want to talk about like justification. Yeah,
Okay. So the gist of it is that you have one group of people who pre- presume that the world is a certain way because that's just the way they interact with it. And then you have another group of
yeah,
people who, because of their position within society, are actually able to better see and better articulate the contradictions between that view of the world and the way it actually is. And the
right,
way I like to think about it is you have someone who's fallen down a well, and then you have somebody who's standing at the top of the well, and they look down and they see a straight, what we think of as like a cartoonish cylindrical well all the way down. And that straight down cylinder presents a certain set of options for you to get yourself out of the well. Why don't you just climb up the side, put your feet over here, climb up? What they cannot see because they are at the top is that it's actually a cave which opens up underneath the opening, and there are no straight sides for you to climb down. And the only way to know that is to be at the bottom looking up. So you
interesting.
have a privileged access to information that is unknowable to the person who is living in the sort of uh, upper echelons of the
Yeah, yeah,
world.
yeah. It's interesting. You're basically tying it all the way back to Plato's cave, and
Yeah.
then the basic allegory of knowledge. It's interesting, right? I talked about how we have this mainstream assumption of an isolated knower, but if you go back to like the origins of Western philosophy and Plato's allegory of the cave, it shows that knowledge is fundamentally social and that knowledge is fundamentally dependent on one's social position.
Right. And yeah, so that's really what that's the idea is. It's just something that floats around. I've read it in one or two of these papers. I think I haven't done a full survey of this. I'm
Yeah.
probably not going to, if I'm being perfectly honest, because it's very dry. And like I said, I'm out of my Adderall. But I expect it shows up here and there. And what has happened is some number of people have taken it upon themselves to take this scholarship and translate it in a way that is easily understood by the public, but is completely divorced from its original intentions and purposes, which is deference
Deference
epistemology.
epistemology. Yeah.
And that essentially means I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, so a point I never really got to was giving just like a succinct definition of standpoint
Sure.
epistemology. So I'll
Yeah,
do that first.
absolutely.
So it's to be clear, it's not the notion that, there is just a set of like oppressors, right? Privileged people and the oppressed, and that every single person in the oppressed category knows more than every single person in the oppressor or privileged category. Basically, the basic thesis can be understood as the fact, in my opinion, fact that one's social position influences the the knowledge one is likely to acquire, or it influences one's beliefs and thus knowledge. And this is a probabilistic kind of assessment. So it's that being in certain social positions can make you more or less likely to be able to acquire certain knowledge. It's not a binary sort of, if you're in this position, therefore you automatically have this knowledge, right? And that would be a kind of, I think, essentialism, because it would say that to be a
Right.
member of, say, this race or this gender is always, necessarily in every case, to have this kind of epistemic advantage, such that you will always have greater knowledge than the person in the other position. But this is not fundamental to standpoint epistemology. Standpoint epistemology, best understood in probabilistic terms, so that people will have a greater chance of acquiring certain knowledge. So this does not claim that white people can never come to understand racial oppression or the plight of Black Americans in society. It does not claim that, men can never be true feminists and can never truly understand the plight of women under patriarchy. Not at all. That kind of claim is deference epistemology. So that once you get into the essentializing and you say that, you know, basically in every case, white people just need to shut up and listen to Black people because they're always going to know more about racial oppression or the experiences, or the ways in which racism operates in society, etc. And also, it would be deference epistemology to tell all men to shut up all the time and just exclusively listen to women when it comes to gender related issues. That would be deference epistemology.
Okay. And that is something that is, and this is where I think a bit of care is needed. Number one, it is something that is being claimed as a essential component of critical race theory by
Yeah.
people like Lindsay and Rufo, when it is in fact very much not. There are probably some critical race
There are
theorists, I would
probably critical
imagine,
race theorists who do that, but I mean,
but
there
by
are,
and large,
yeah,
it's largely an advocacy of standpoint rather than deference, from what I can gather. Would you say that's fair?
right, especially because of, the fact that anti-essentialism is such a crucial part of critical race theory for most critical
Right.
race theorists. Yeah.
So that claim is just factually incorrect. The
Right.
problem is there is another group of people who have, whether or not they have access to the scholarship and have internalized its messages and are cynically using it for other purposes, or they're just doing their own thing, they are advocating for what seems to be a type of deference epistemology, and they're operating in a space that is, it's where most people, particularly in the corporate world, are likely to encounter these ideas,
Exactly.
and that is our diversity training friends, and
Mhm.
that is our Kendys and our D'Angelos, and those are the big two, I think. Is there
Yeah.
anybody else on that list that would be?
Those are going to be the main two, and I'll say to Kendi's credit, I haven't seen him invoke deference epistemology. I think
Mhm.
the problems with Kendi's approach to anti-racism lie elsewhere, but
Okay.
D'Angelo really does push you know things that can only be described as extreme forms of standpoint or straight up deference epistemology. Yeah, largely I would say deference epistemology.
And so what has happened to my eyes, and I'll describe what I think is happening and what I see happening, and you tell me if this is correct or at what point I lost the plot. So there are a bunch of corporations who are wanting to go full on rah-rah neoliberal rainbow capitalism. They don't want to make actual concessions to the system in which we live that would afford people a better standard of living. They don't want to address the structural inequalities in our system. What they want to do instead is to adopt the language of progressivism to appear to be progressive and to throw people a bone, and Democrats are particularly susceptible to this,
Uh-huh.
where we will make the appearance of appealing to these high-minded progressive ideas and ideas about equality and inclusion in such a way that we don't actually have to do anything.
Exactly.
And how that manifests is it creates an entirely new marketplace for people to come in and create very bad PowerPoint presentations where they bring people into rooms and sit them down and explain that all white people are inherently racist, which we could debate about actually for a given
Sure.
definition of
Sure.
racism.
Sure.
But it's done very poorly. It's communicated poorly. It scares the shit out of everybody in the room. They walk away not understanding what progressivism actually is, and they don't actually fix the problem of
Right.
systemic
Right.
racism because that would kill their market base,
Yeah.
and they
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to charge $3,000 an hour speaking fees. And
Oh,
then James
20,000.
Lindsay and Chris Rufo get a hold of these presentations and say, look, this
Right.
is what critical race theory is.
And I mean, as you pointed out, not only do they not do anything to address the systemic racism on a societal level, they don't even do anything to address workplace racism in the actual settings that they go in and are intended to be able to ameliorate these issues. Like there's lots of sociological research on these kinds of popular woke corporate diversity seminars, and the data suggests that the vast majority of the time they have no positive effect on racial relations within the workplace, and they can even have counterproductive effects, making issues worse the way that they're
Mhm.
currently set up. So, and that, I mean, counts as even further evidence in favor of the claim that you were making, which is that they don't want to solve this problem because they need to maintain, the demand for their product. Because if they can go around and actually fix the problems, then well, all it's going to take is one round of diversity training for each office setting, and then well, their job is done. So, yeah, I mean, it's really quite a toxic thing, and as you said, the fact that is so pervasive, um, and so dishonest in terms of its sort of complete lack of ability to do what it advertises itself as doing. It just creates like it really poisons the well of public discourse on anti-racism, and the fact that it can be plenty of these diversity trainers will claim that they are implementing the practices of critical race theory or the theoretical approach of critical race theory, which makes it even more, you know, uh, which makes it just even more
Right.
plausible for the Rufos and Lindsays to claim this is just critical race theory in practice.
Right. When at bottom, what it fundamentally is an elaboration on that one ad where Kendall Jenner hands a cop a Pepsi and everything's racism. Right. Like it's basically just that, but with PowerPoint behind you. Um, and it's just so it's hard for me not to approach it from just a deeply cynical perspective where
Yeah.
I don't necessarily blame the individuals because they're doing this really is just the culmination of like rainbow capitalism, right? It's
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
this is precisely what you would expect to happen
Yep.
in the type of world that we've created. And the fallout from it is that you take these they're obviously ridiculous. Like we could sit here and do an entire podcast just pointing out the flaws in all of these diversity trainings.
Mhm.
And all it does is give ammunition for the people who are fomenting a moral panic. And it like we said, it does nothing to fix the actual issues. So I don't know what the solution to that is because it seems like whenever I try to have a conversation with somebody in my personal life, which is not very often about this, but I try to explain that's actually not critical race theory. That's not real progressivism. That's this other
Mhm.
thing. I have a hard time convincing people of that.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that is very bad for us.
Yeah. I mean, I deeply agree. I think that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Diversity training can be
Mhm.
done well, right? That you can approach these topics in a constructive way that allows for communication and open, honest dialogue and honesty and you know intellectual honesty and good faith, and rather than sort of uh you know rather than uh, how do you say it, singling out, say, white people and straight men and whatever identity category uh is being focused on as, say, problematic or privileged. I mean, I think that the idea of privilege, the way that it's intended to be communicated, like the content, when people say that white privilege exists, for most people saying that sort of thing, I think that's absolutely correct. But I think the framework of privilege largely prevents it from being a productive conversation in many cases, because people have these sorts of walls that they put up when they are uh, when they perceive the conversation as being accusatory, as sort of blaming them, or as claiming, for instance, that all white people, no matter how poor they are, have it better than all black people, no matter how rich they are. I mean, the room for misinterpretation is too vast in many cases, and a lot of it comes down to using the wrong sorts of concepts and metaphors. I think privilege, white privilege, the idea, the philosopher Lewis Gordon, who works on Africana philosophy and racism and these sorts of issues, says that he doesn't like the language of privilege. He prefers to talk about white license. White people have license
Hmm.
to do certain things. It's
I
not a
like that. I
privilege
like
to
that a lot,
storm.
actually.
Yeah, it's not a privilege to storm the Capitol, right? It's those white people had license to do that sort of thing. And also, th-
Mm.
there's one problem at the heart of the privilege discourse, is that that word can refer to two different things that are very different. One being things that white people uh, get to enjoy, that all people should enjoy, certain rights, right? Like the right not to be
Mm.
racially profiled. But then that could also refer to things that white people uh, unjustly enjoy that nobody should get to enjoy. Like, for instance,
Mm.
given extra credibility when complaining of a certain crime, say, or your word being taken at a sort of not only like more than people of color, but inflated, right? That you're getting more than you deserve. That's a huge problem. And so to talk about white license, I think frames the issue in a better way. So like there are ways that we could sit down and try to address this. And I think there probably are some, corporate diversity and consulting firms that do a much better job of this. The problem still is that
Mhm.
inevitably the Rufos and Lindsays can go hunt them down and frame them closer to the ways that you see from the D'Angelo, et cetera, such that you can plausibly group them all into one basket.
Yeah, I think that I guess the question comes down to, in terms of just practical implementation of doing this sort of thing and engaging in the project meaningfully, how do you get white people to acknowledge any internalized racism they might have without it turning into a Maoist struggle session, as Peterson has liked to call it,
Hmm.
right? Like, I don't really have a problem talking about my own hangups, but I think I'm unique in that in a lot of ways. I think it makes
I
people
agree.
deeply uncomfortable to talk about the ways in which they're flawed, for a number of valid reasons, especially in our current social media climate. I think we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that there are forces on the left that are actually antagonistic to this project as well.
Oh yeah.
So, like, for instance, admitting internalized racism is a very good way to get you accused of being a racist, and that's counterproductive to
Right.
right. Twitter's not a good place to do this sort of shit. Um, and I don't know how to. because obviously we have to figure out a way to go forward with this. We have to
Yeah.
figure out a way to move beyond and do the things we want to do. And I don't know how we cut through this sea of just badness on all sides. Have you had any luck in the conversations you've been having with people? You've been out there doing God's work for a little while now. Like, have you seen
I've
the
been
light?
trying. So very few of the conversations that I ever have with people on this kind of issue end up uh, focusing on things like, you know, you need to reflect internally and find examples of times in which you've had racist biases or something like that. That's not something that I've focused on. And
Hmm.
to perhaps there is an element of that which can be productive, and you need to find a balance
Hmm.
between, you know, uh, between not addressing that at all and addressing it in a completely um, unproductive or counterproductive way, a la D'Angelo. It's an empirical question ultimately, and I think maybe something akin to cognitive behavioral therapy with focus
Mm.
on uh, one's internal racial compass, perhaps you could call it, could be a decent starting point. I mean, fundamentally, in my experience, what has pushed certain white people to get to the place where they are completely comfortable um, acknowledging their own shortcomings and acknowledging times in which they made racist assumptions uh, or acted in racist ways without knowing it. Um, as well-intentioned, white liberals. That's like the last thing that they want to realize of them. Oh no, I was racist, right? Because uh, we don't recognize the extent to which this can so easily be internalized, and if not, subjected to relentless scrutiny, can continue to operate on a you know on a on an unconscious or subconscious level. What I've found, the white people who I think, like myself, end up being very passionate about achieving racial progress and inspiring others to try to um, join in the fight for racial justice is largely due to uh, two things. One being relationships with Black people and people of color, where tough conversations can be held and open, uh, open, you know, challenging dialogue can occur and does occur, and you listen actively to the experiences that they've had in society that you might not have been aware were happening. Because, for instance, as a white person, I've been pulled over once in my life. I was going 96 miles an hour. I have Black friends who've been pulled over 60 times in their life. Never once were they violating any traffic laws. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
If you that's not the kind of thing that you are likely to find in, like, a textbook somewhere, right? That is the sort of thing that you need to learn through friendship or relationship or dialogue, serious dialogue with another person who has different experience from you. So that's one thing, is relationships and
Yeah.
open, honest dialogue, and the other just being history. Uh, to an actual serious reckoning with the history of racial subordination, white supremacy, racial exploitation, racial double standards, racial violence, racial sexual violence, all sorts of issues. I mean, you
Mm.
you can never stop learning about just how deep these roots are in American society. And I consider myself
Yeah.
only partly along the way, but once you get to a certain point, I think you can't really deny that something needs to be done.
Yeah. Once you understand how thoroughly cavernous that well actually is, like, it becomes
Yeah.
difficult to look away. I think that a through line through a lot of the conversations that I've had in this little project of mine has been that while there is no such thing as a panacea, that cosmopolitanism is a cure for a vast number of our problems. Just not like collecting, your little rare Pokemon friends, like, we don't wanna do that, but just having real, actual, genuine relationships with people who are different than you.
Yeah.
And not even necessarily intimate relationships, right? If you living in a place
Yeah.
where your barista or your mechanic or your boss or you live on a floor with 5 or 6 people of a different race, where you're interacting with other human beings in a way that you cannot help by the nature of your relationship with and to them to
Mhm.
understand their humanity at a very visceral level. This is a person, this is a thing like me. Um, Living in that type of a culture is one of the fastest and easiest ways to disabuse people of any of these other bad ideas. Um, so I am now an advocate for that. I don't know
Yeah.
if I was ever not an advocate for cosmopolitanism, but I certainly am now, because it strikes me as just the easiest way to get past those roadblocks is just having conversations and interacting with people who are different than you.
I echo that 100%.
Yeah. Um, well, I think that might be a good spot to end it on, friend. Well, I like to
Yeah.
end on a happy note, and if we can also have a prescription for action for our people who are listening, is just talk to people. Like, get to
Yeah.
know people who are different than you and try to understand where they're coming from. And if they say something to you that seems out of sorts with your worldview, that is when you should pay closer attention rather than disengage.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Open yourself up, be vulnerable, because if you're not vulnerable, you can't learn.
absolutely. Sam Hoadley-Brill, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate having you on, man. It was good.
It has been a blessing, my
Yeah,
man. I appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
yeah. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.